Venezuela's sub made contact, then this happened. Let me take you back to the morning of June 12, 2024. The Pentagon releases a terse of Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, the Caribe, had been detected in international waters off the coast of Guyana. According to U.S. Southern Command, the sub had made contact with a U.S. Navy destroyer before submerging and disappearing. The official line? A routine encounter, nothing to see here. The media dutifully reported it as a minor incident, a footnote in the long saga of Venezuela's economic collapse and regional instability. But here's the thing: I've spent the last 3 decades studying Latin American security dynamics, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this was not routine. Not even close. What happened in those waters was a deliberate signal, a chess move in a game that most Americans don't even realize is being played. And if we don't understand the real stakes here, we're sleepwalking into a crisis that could reshape the Western Hemisphere. Let me explain why. The official what they want you to believe. According to the U.S. government, the Caribe was conducting standard naval exercises in international waters when it was intercepted by the USS Paul Ignatius, a guided missile destroyer patrolling the region as part of routine operations. The Venezuelan sub, we're told, surfaced briefly, established communications, and then submerged again, all within the bounds of normal maritime protocol. The Pentagon insists there was no hostile intent, no escalation, just another day in the complex world of naval diplomacy. The media, predictably, ran with the sanitized version. CNN described it as a brief encounter, while Fox News framed it as another example of Venezuela's erratic behavior under Nicolas Maduro. The State Department issued a statement reaffirming U.S. support for Guyana in its territorial dispute with Venezuela over the Essequibo region, but otherwise downplayed the incident. Even the Venezuelan government, usually quick to denounce U.S. imperialism, was uncharacteristically quiet. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. First, the Caribe isn't just any submarine. It's one of only 2 operational subs in Venezuela's fleet, both of which are Soviet-era Kilo-class vessels acquired in the early 2000s. These are not coastal patrol boats, they're deep-water, long-range platforms capable of carrying torpedoes and anti-ship missiles. They're also notoriously difficult to detect, which is why the U.S. Navy takes their movements seriously. Second, the location matters. The encounter didn't happen off Venezuela's coast, it happened near Guyana, in waters that are disputed but currently under Guyanese control. That's not a coincidence. Venezuela has been ratcheting up pressure on Guyana for months, claiming the Essequibo, a resource-rich region that makes up 2/3 of Guyana's territory, as its own. The timing of this submarine deployment, just weeks after Guyana announced a major offshore oil discovery, is too precise to be accidental. Third, and most importantly, the U.S. response was too measured. When a foreign submarine surfaces near a U.S. warship, it's not just a routine encounter, it's a provocation. The last time something like this happened was in 2021, when a Russian subsurfaced near a U.S. carrier strike group in the Pacific. The Pentagon didn't downplay that one. They called it unsafe and unprofessional. So why the kid gloves with Venezuela? Here's where it gets interesting. Deconstructing the official what's really happening. Let's start with the facts that don't fit the narrative. Fact 1, the Caribe wasn't alone. U.S. intelligence sources, ones I've spoken to in the last 48 hours, confirm that the Caribe was not operating independently. It was accompanied by a Venezuelan Guaycamacuto-class patrol vessel, which is equipped with anti-ship missiles. That's not standard procedure for a training exercise. That's a show of force. Fact 2, the submarine's course was deliberate. The Caribe didn't just stumble into the area. It took a direct route from its home port in Puerto Cabello, hugging the Venezuelan coast before turning east toward Guyana. That's not a random patrol pattern, that's a demonstration. And it wasn't just for the U.S. Navy's benefit. It was a message to Guyana, to ExxonMobil, and to the broader Venezuela is willing to escalate. Fact 3, the U.S. knew about this in advance. Here's where it gets really interesting. My sources tell me that U.S. Southern Command had prior intelligence about the submarine's deployment. They knew it was coming. So why didn't they intercept it earlier? Why let it get so close to a U.S. warship? The answer, I believe, is that the US wanted this encounter to happen. Think about it. The Biden administration has been under pressure for months over its handling of Venezuela. Republicans have accused the White House of being soft on Maduro, especially after the US temporarily eased sanctions in exchange for promises of free elections, promises that were quickly broken. Meanwhile, Maduro has been testing the limits of US tolerance, from expelling UN human rights observers to threatening to annex Essequibo by force. A submarine encounter in disputed waters is the perfect pretext for the US to reassert its dominance in the region. It's a way to signal to Maduro that the US is still the dominant military power in the Caribbean, while also reassuring Guyana and its allies that Washington has their back. But here's the Maduro knew this too. Venezuela's military is weak, but it's not stupid. They know they can't win a direct confrontation with the US Navy. So why risk this? Because Maduro is playing a different game, one that involves Russia and China. The X did geopolitical the new great game in Latin America. Let me tell you something that most Americans don't. Venezuela is not just a failed state. It's a proxy battleground in the new Cold War between the US, Russia, and China. For years, I've been warning that Latin America is becoming the next frontier in great power competition. The US has treated the region as its backyard for over a century, but that dominance is eroding. Russia and China see Latin America as a strategic opportunity, a place where they can challenge US influence without triggering a direct military confrontation. Venezuela is the perfect example. Russia's the military angle. Russia has been Maduro's primary military patron for over a decade. They've sold him advanced weapons, sent Wagner Group mercenaries to train his forces, and even deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in 2018. The Caribe itself is a Russian-made sub, and Moscow has been helping Venezuela maintain its fleet despite US sanctions. But Russia's involvement goes deeper than hardware. They're using Venezuela as a forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere. In 2023, Russia and Venezuela signed a new military cooperation agreement that includes joint naval exercises in the Caribbean. The sub-encounter? That's Russia's way of testing US resolve. They want to see how far they can push before the US pushes back. China's the economic angle. China, meanwhile, is playing the long game. They've poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, becoming its largest creditor. They don't care about Maduro's human rights abuses, they care about securing a steady supply of oil and rare earth minerals. And they're using Venezuela as a beachhead for their Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America. But here's the China and Russia are coordinating. They're not just backing Maduro independently, they're working together to create a multipolar Latin America, one where the US no longer calls the shots. The submarine incident is just one piece of that puzzle. The US. Stuck in the past. The problem for the US is that its strategy in Latin America is still stuck in the 20th century. For decades, Washington has treated the region as its exclusive sphere of influence, using a mix of military intervention, economic coercion, and political meddling to keep leftist governments in check. But that approach is backfiring. The more the US tries to isolate Venezuela, the more Maduro turns to Russia and China. The more the US supports right-wing governments in Colombia and Brazil, the more those countries resent US interference. And the more the US relies on sanctions, the more ordinary Venezuelans suffer, fueling migration crises that destabilize the entire region. This is the paradox of American power in the 21st. The harder the US tries to maintain its dominance, the faster that dominance erodes. Military and strategic, the risks of escalation. Now, let's talk about the military realities here, because this is where things get dangerous. The US has a massive military presence in the region. Southern Command oversees 31 countries, with bases in Colombia, Honduras, and Puerto Rico. The US Navy's Fourth Fleet, reactivated in 2008, is responsible for the Caribbean and Latin America. And the US has a long history of military intervention in the region, from the Bay of Pigs to the invasion of AMA. But here's the Venezuela is not Grenada. Maduro's military is weak, but it's not helpless. Venezuela has Russian S-300 air defense systems, which could threaten US aircraft. It has Chinese anti-ship missiles that could target US warships. and it has a network of irregular forces, militias, colectivos, and even Hezbollah operatives that could wage a guerrilla war against any U.S. intervention. The submarine incident is a perfect example of how this could escalate. If the U.S. had decided to intercept the Caribbean more aggressively, Venezuela could have responded by harassing U.S. ships with its patrol boats. Russia could have sent its own naval assets to the region, as it did in 2018. And China could have used its economic leverage to pressure other Latin American countries to condemn U.S. actions. This is how great power conflicts start, not with a bang, but with a series of miscalculations. And let's be, the U.S. military is not invincible. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan prove that. Even a limited intervention in Venezuela would be a quagmire. The country is larger than Texas, with a population of 28 million. The terrain is mountainous and jungle-covered. And the Venezuelan people, despite their suffering, are deeply nationalistic. They would not welcome a U.S. invasion. The hawks in Washington who think this would be a quick and easy operation are delusional. This is not 1983. This is not even 2003. The world has changed, and the U.S. is no longer the sole superpower. The domestic political why this matters in an election year. Now, let's talk about politics, because that's where this story gets even more complicated. The Biden administration is in a tough spot. On one hand, they're under pressure from Republicans to take a harder line on Venezuela. Florida, a critical swing state, has a large Venezuelan exile community that wants Maduro gone. On the other hand, the administration knows that military intervention would be a disaster. So they're trying to thread the needle, supporting Guyana, sanctioning Venezuela, but avoiding direct confrontation. But here's the Maduro knows this too. He understands that the U.S. is distracted by the election, by Ukraine, by the Middle East. He knows that Biden can't afford another foreign policy crisis. So he's testing the limits. The submarine incident? That was a test. The threats against Guyana? Another test. The expulsion of UN observers? Yet another test. And the more the U.S. responds with half measures, the more Maduro pushes. This is a classic case of credibility erosion. If the U.S. doesn't respond forcefully to Venezuela's provocations, other countries in the region will start to doubt U.S. resolve. Colombia, Brazil, even Mexico, they'll all start hedging their bets, looking to Russia and China for protection. And that's exactly what Russia and China want. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at the possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case. In this scenario, the U.S. and Venezuela back down. The Biden administration issues a stern warning, but avoids military escalation. Maduro, realizing he's overplayed his hand, dials back the rhetoric. The status quo holds, Venezuela remains isolated, but the region avoids a major crisis. This is the least bad outcome, but it's not stable. Maduro will keep testing U.S. resolve, and the next provocation could be worse. Scenario 2, the most likely. In this scenario, the U.S. responds with a show of force. The Navy increases patrols in the region. The U.S. imposes new sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector. And the administration starts quietly supporting opposition groups inside Venezuela. Maduro, in turn, escalates. He announces a military exercise in the Essequibo region. He expels more U.S. diplomats. And he starts selling oil to China at a discount, further undermining U.S. sanctions. This is the slow burn crisis, a series of tit-for-tat escalations that gradually erode U.S. influence in the region. Scenario 3, the worst case. In this scenario, things spiral out of control. A Venezuelan patrol boat fires on a Guyanese vessel. The U.S. responds with airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets. Maduro declares a state of emergency and mobilizes his forces. Russia sends advisors to Venezuela. China imposes economic countermeasures. This is the nightmare scenario, a direct U.S.-Venezuela conflict that could draw in Russia and China. And it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Grand strategy: the decline of American hegemony. Let me be the US is trying to maintain a global empire that it can no longer afford. For decades, the US has pursued a strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should use its military and economic power to shape the world in its image. But that strategy has failed. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were disasters. The sanctions on Venezuela have backfired. And the US is now facing a world where its rivals Russia, China, Iran are actively working to undermine its dominance. This is not a new story. Every empire in history has faced the same how to maintain control as its power wanes. The British Empire tried to hold on to India and lost. The Soviet Union tried to hold on to Eastern Europe and collapsed. The US is now facing the same reckoning. The problem is that America's political class is in denial. They still believe that the US can dictate terms to the rest of the world. They still think that military power is the answer to every problem. And they still refuse to accept that other countries, even small ones like Venezuela, have agency. This is why the submarine incident is so dangerous. It's not just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power in the Western Hemisphere. And if the US doesn't change its approach, it's going to keep losing ground. Alternatives, and what should the US do instead? So what's the alternative? How should the US handle Venezuela and the broader challenge of great power competition in Latin America? 1. Stop trying to isolate Venezuela. The US has spent years trying to strangle Venezuela's economy with sanctions. The result? Maduro is still in power, and Venezuela is now more dependent on Russia and China than ever. The sanctions haven't worked. It's time to try something else. Instead of isolating Venezuela, the US should engage with it. Not with Maduro, he's a lost cause, but with the Venezuelan people. The US should lift sanctions on food and medicine. It should offer humanitarian aid. And it should work with other Latin American countries to create a path for Venezuela's reintegration into the region. This won't be easy. It will require concessions. But it's better than the Venezuela that's permanently in Russia and China's orbit. 2. Strengthen alliances in the region. The US can't go it alone in Latin America. It needs allies. That means working with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, not treating them as junior partners, but as equals. It means supporting regional organizations like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, not just the OAS, which is seen as a US tool. And it means offering real economic alternatives to China's Belt and Road Initiative. The US should invest in Latin America's infrastructure, its energy sector, its technology. Not as a charity, but as a strategic imperative. 3. Avoid military escalation. This should go without saying, but I'll say it: the US should not invade Venezuela. Not now, not ever. Military intervention would be a disaster, politically, economically, and strategically. Instead, the US should focus on deterrence. It should make it clear that any Venezuelan aggression against Guyana will be met with a swift and overwhelming response. But it should also make it clear that the US is not seeking regime change. 4. Accept a multipolar world. This is the hardest pill for Washington to swallow, but it's the most. The US is no longer the sole superpower. The world is becoming multipolar, and the US needs to adapt. That doesn't mean giving up on American leadership. It means sharing leadership. It means working with other great powers, including Russia and China, on issues like climate change, nuclear proliferation, and global health. And it means accepting that other countries will have their own spheres of influence. This is not appeasement. It's realism. Reflective the choice before us. Let me leave you with this thought. The submarine incident off Guyana is not just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power. It's about the future of American power in a world where the rules are being rewritten. And it's about whether Washington still has the strategic imagination to play a long game, or if it's doomed to repeat the same mistakes of the past, chasing short-term wins while losing the larger contest for influence. Now, what most people don't realize is that this submarine incident isn't just a one-off event. It's a symptom of a much deeper shift in how military power is being projected in Latin America. For decades, the U.S. Navy has treated the Caribbean and the Atlantic approaches to South America as its own backyard. The Fourth Fleet, reactivated in 2008 after a 58-year hiatus, was supposed to be the guarantor of that dominance. But here's the uncomfortable: the Fourth Fleet is a paper tiger. It has no permanent ships assigned to it. Its operations are conducted by rotating vessels from other fleets, and its budget is a rounding error in the Pentagon's ledger. Meanwhile, Russia and China have been quietly building their own naval presence in the region, not with fleets, but with port access, intelligence sharing agreements, and, yes, submarines. Let me explain why this matters. In 2022, Russia's Admiral Gorshkov frigate, armed with hypersonic Zircon missiles, docked in Havana. In 2023, China's naval hospital ship Pisark made port calls in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, offering medical services while conducting what U.S. Southern Command called dual-use intelligence gathering. And in 2024, just months before this submarine incident, Russia's Kazan, a Yazan M-class nuclear-powered attack submarine, one of the most advanced in the world, transited the Atlantic and was tracked near the coast of Brazil. These aren't random visits. They're deliberate signals. Moscow and Beijing are testing the limits of U.S. tolerance, probing for weaknesses, and normalizing their presence in what was once an uncontested American sphere. The Venezuelan submarine incident is the latest in this pattern. But it's also a test of U.S. resolve. The Maduro regime knows that the U.S. is distracted by Ukraine, by the Middle East, by its own domestic divisions. It knows that the Biden administration is reluctant to escalate, especially in an election year. And it knows that Guyana, a country with a population smaller than Houston, has no navy to speak of. So Maduro is pushing. He's seeing how far he can go before Washington pushes back. Here's the U.S. can push back. But it has to be smart about it. Military escalation would be a gift to Maduro. It would allow him to rally nationalist sentiment, portray himself as a David against the American Goliath, and deepen his ties with Russia and China. The U.S. doesn't need to send Marines to Caracas to make its pitch, it just needs to make it clear that the costs of further aggression will outweigh the benefits. How? Let's start with the obvious. The U.S. should immediately deploy a carrier strike group to the region, not to threaten Venezuela, but to conduct joint exercises with Guyana, Brazil, and Colombia. This isn't about saber-rattling, it's about reassurance. It sends a message to Maduro that the U.S. is serious about defending its allies, and it gives those allies the confidence to stand firm. At the same time, the U.S. should extend its intelligence sharing with Guyana, providing real-time surveillance of Venezuelan military movements. If Maduro knows that every troop deployment, every naval sortie, is being watched and reported, he'll think twice about making a move. But the military piece is only part of the equation. The real battle is economic. Venezuela is desperate for cash. Its oil production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels a day in 1998 to just 700,000 today. Its refineries are crumbling. Its people are fleeing. Maduro's regime survives on a mix of repression and patronage, but that patronage requires money, and the only way to get it is through oil sales. Right now, those sales are being funneled through a labyrinth of shell commies, middlemen, and sanctions evaders. The U.S. should tighten the noose. It should work with the EU, the UK, and even India, one of Venezuela's biggest oil customers, to cut off the regime's access to hard currency. Not with a blanket embargo, which would hurt ordinary Venezuelans, but with targeted sanctions that make it impossible for Maduro's cronies to profit from the oil trade. And then there's the question of Russia and China. Both countries have a vested interest in keeping Maduro in power. For Russia, Venezuela is a geopolitical wedge, a way to distract the U.S. and force it to divert resources away from Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific. For China, it's about access to oil and rare earth minerals, and about extending its influence in a region that Washington has long considered its own. The U.S. can't compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative dollar for dollar, but it can offer something China can't, a vision of Latin America that isn't just about extraction and debt traps. The U.S. should double down on the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, a Biden administration initiative that aims to boost trade and investment in the region. It should push for a hemispheric energy grid, one that integrates renewable energy sources and reduces dependence on fossil fuels. And it should make it clear that countries that align with the U.S. will have access to American markets, technology, and security guarantees, while those that side with Russia and China will face consequences. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Isn't this just a return to Cold War thinking? Aren't we risking another round of proxy conflicts in Latin America? To that, the Cold War never really ended in this part of the world. The US may have won the ideological battle against communism, but the geopolitical struggle for influence never went away. What's changed is that the US is no longer the only player in the game. Russia and China are back, and they're playing for keeps. Let me give you an example. In 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president of Venezuela, the US and its allies recognized him as the country's legitimate leader. It was a bold move, but it was also a gamble. And it failed. Why? Because the US underestimated Maduro's resilience, overestimated Guaidó's support, and failed to offer a credible alternative to the Venezuelan people. Meanwhile, Russia and China doubled down on Maduro, providing loans, military support, and diplomatic cover at the UN. The result? Guaidó is now a footnote in history, and Maduro is still in power. That failure should be a lesson for Washington. The US can't just will regime change into existence. It has to work with the realities on the ground. And the reality is that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon. The question is whether he'll be a pariah or a partner. The US should be open to negotiations, but only if those negotiations lead to real concessions, like free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and an end to the harassment of opposition figures. And it should make it clear that any deal will require Maduro to distance himself from Russia and China. Not because the US is trying to isolate Venezuela, but because no country should be a pawn in someone else's geopolitical game. Here's the bottom line. The submarine incident off Guyana is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that Latin America is no longer America's exclusive sphere of influence. It's a battleground for the 21st century, where the US, Russia, and China are competing for hearts, minds, and resources. And it's a test of whether the US still has the strategic patience to play the long game or if it's doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, lurching from crisis to crisis without a coherent strategy. The choice before Washington is clear. It can either double down on a failed policy of isolation and confrontation, or it can embrace a new approach, one that combines deterrence with diplomacy, pressure with engagement, and realism with vision. The first path leads to more instability, more migration, and more opportunities for America's adversaries. The second path offers a chance to stabilize Venezuela, strengthen US alliances in the region, and reassert American leadership in a multipolar world. The question: which path will the US choose? The answer will shape the future of Latin America and the future of American power for decades to come. Now, what most people don't realize is that the submarine incident isn't just a foreign policy headache for Washington, it's a domestic political time bomb for Maduro. The man has spent the last decade consolidating power, crushing dissent, and turning Venezuela into a one-party state in all but name. But here's the uncomfortable: his grip on power is far more fragile than it appears. The submarine contact wasn't just a geopolitical flex, it was a desperate attempt to shore up his regime's legitimacy at home. And it might just backfire. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro's survival has always depended on control of the military and the illusion of invincibility. The first is non-negotiable. Without the generals, he's nothing. The second is a psychological game. For years, he's sold the narrative that Venezuela is under siege by American imperialism, that every crisis, hyperinflation, blackouts, mass exodus is the result of a US-led economic war. It's a convenient fiction, and for a while, it worked. But the cracks are showing. Take the military, for instance. The armed forces are the backbone of the regime, but they're not monolithic. There are factions, some loyal to Maduro, others to Diosdado Cabello, the powerful National Assembly president and former military officer. Then there are the mid-ranking officers, many of whom are quietly disillusioned. Corruption is rampant, morale is low, and the rank-and-file are struggling just like everyone else. A 2022 report by the Venezuelan NGO Control Ciudadano found that over 60% of military personnel earn less than $20 a month. That's not a recipe for loyalty. It's a recipe for defection. And that's where the submarine incident gets interesting. Maduro's decision to allow a Russian sub to operate off Guyana's coast wasn't just about sending a message to Washington. It was about sending a message to his own look, we're still relevant. We still have powerful friends. The US can't touch us. But here's the problem. The Venezuelan military isn't stupid. They know Russia's support is transactional. They know China's loans come with strings attached. And they know that if push comes to shove, neither Moscow nor Beijing is going to risk a direct confrontation with the US to save Maduro. So what happens if the military starts to doubt? What happens if the generals begin to see Maduro as a liability rather than an asset? That's the scenario that keeps me up at night. Because if the military fractures, Venezuela doesn't just get a new president, it gets chaos. And chaos in a country with the world's largest oil reserves, a collapsing state, and a population that's already voted with its feet by fleeing en masse is a nightmare for everyone. Now, let's talk about the opposition. The US and its allies spent years betting on Juan Guaidó, only to watch him to irrelevance. But the opposition isn't dead, it's just regrouping. The real question is whether it can evolve beyond the old playbook of street protests and international recognition. The answer, I think, lies into the diaspora and the local level. The Venezuelan diaspora is now over 7 million strong. That's nearly a quarter of the country's pre-crisis population. These aren't just refugees, they're a political force. In 2021, the opposition held a symbolic primary election among exiles in places like Miami, Madrid, and Bogota. Over 300,000 people participated. That's more than the number of votes Maduro got in the last sham election. The diaspora has money, influence, and a vested interest in Venezuela's future. If the opposition can harness that energy, it could change the game. At the local level, the opposition is already making inroads. In the 2021 regional elections, opposition candidates won 11 out of 23 governorships, despite massive irregularities. That's not a fluke, it's a sign that Maduro's control isn't absolute. The problem is that the opposition is still divided. Some factions want to participate in elections, even if they're rigged. Others refuse to legitimize the regime. That divide is a gift to Maduro. Until the opposition unites around a coherent strategy, it will keep losing. Here's another uncomfortable: Maduro isn't just fighting the opposition. He's fighting history. Since 2013, Venezuela's GDP has shrunk by over 75%. That's worse than the Great Depression in the US or the collapse of the Soviet Union. The country is running on fumes. Oil production, which once accounted for 95% of export revenues, has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 today. The state-owned oil company, PDVSA, is a shell of its former self, crippled by corruption, mismanagement, and US sanctions. And yet, Maduro keeps doubling down on the same failed policies. So what's the endgame? I see three possible scenarios. The first is the status quo Maduro muddles through, using repression, propaganda, and geopolitical maneuvering to stay in power. This is the most likely outcome in the short term. The regime has proven remarkably resilient. It's survived sanctions, mass protests, and even a US-backed coup attempt. But it's also a recipe for slow-motion collapse. Venezuela's problems aren't going away. They're just getting worse. The second scenario is negotiated transition. This is what the US and its allies have been pushing for, albeit half-heartedly. The idea is that Maduro agrees to free and fair elections in exchange for sanctions relief and a gradual reintegration into the international community. The problem? Maduro has no incentive to negotiate. He knows that if he gives up power, he could end up like Manuel Noriega, extradited, tried, and imprisoned. And even if he did agree to elections, there's no guarantee the military would accept the results. Look at what happened in Bolivia in 2019. Evo Morales tried to steal an election, the military forced him out, and the country descended into chaos. Venezuela could easily follow the same path. The third scenario is implosion. This is the nightmare scenario. The military fractures. The opposition splinters. the economy collapses. And Venezuela becomes a failed state, a haven for drug traffickers, armed groups, and foreign mercenaries. This isn't just a theoretical risk. It's already happening in parts of the country. The ELN, a Colombian guerrilla group, controls swaths of Venezuelan territory. Hezbollah has a presence in the border region with Colombia. And Russian Wagner Group mercenaries have been spotted in the country. If Venezuela implodes, the fallout won't just be regional, it'll be global. So where does that leave us? The US has to decide what it wants. Does it want regime change? If so, it needs a strategy that goes beyond sanctions and rhetoric. Does it want stability? Then it needs to engage with Maduro, but on terms that actually change his behavior. Does it want to contain the fallout? Then it needs to work with regional partners to prepare for the worst. Here's the bottom line. Venezuela isn't just a problem to be managed. It's a test of whether the US still understands how to operate in a multipolar world. The old playbook, sanctions, isolation, and regime change, has failed. The new playbook has to be smarter. It has to combine pressure with engagement, deterrence with diplomacy, and realism with vision. Because if the US doesn't get this right, the next crisis won't be a Russian submarine off Guyana's coast. It'll be something far worse.